Thank you, Presiding Officer, and let me move the motion in my name at this stage, lest I forget. Presiding Officer, migration has had a hugely positive impact on Scotland throughout our history. We've been enriched in it by the contribution of those who have chosen to make Scotland their home. The positive impact of migration to Scotland can be felt in our families, in our communities, in our workplaces, and indeed in this very Parliament. Every day we see the important role people have chosen to make their home in Scotland play in supporting the delivery of our public services in all sectors of our economy, in the academic and student communities of our colleges and universities, and in our rich shared culture. While we should be rightly proud of the history of migrants in this country, we also know that migration is vital to Scotland's future as well. For the past 2 decades, migration has been the main driver of population growth in Scotland. In addition to international migrants choosing Scotland as their home, inward migration from the rest of the UK to Scotland has been greater than outward migration from Scotland for every year since 2001-2002. Migration matters to Scotland. That's why continuing to stress that Scotland is a welcoming, attractive country for those seeking to make a contribution here is essential. But Scotland's migration policy is decided not here in this Parliament, but at Westminster. Both the Tories and the Labour Party want to keep it that way. And that means we're at the mercy of right-wing UK government Home Secretaries seemingly determined to adopt ever more extreme language and policy positions. Indeed, it's hard to imagine anything more damaging to Scotland's interests than the disgraceful, shameful rhetoric warning of a hurricane of migrants coming our way. Suella Braverman may no more be Home Secretary, but there's no indication that James Cleverly will change direction. And for the current UK government, the hostile environment has not been hostile enough.
This is showing you net migration. So the number of people coming in minus those who are leaving the country. And last time around, that's what the line looked like, very high indeed. The latest figures show it's even higher. It's even higher. It does look like it's coming down, but those numbers could well be revised. And it got up to over 700,000 in 2022. But even more striking is if you look back through history. So we're going to take that same statistic, net migration, as a percentage of the population, going all the way back to the Victorian period here. And where you can see the story. We have never seen anything quite like this. Actually, for most of the 19th century, people were leaving the country in net terms. But then you have this kind of period, hundreds of thousands under David Cameron, and then post-Brexit, it went through the roof.
Hello. So I'm just effectively trying something a bit different this time around, as opposed to recording a video the way I normally would. I'm sort of using StreamYard and seeing how that goes. But I thought I would just initially start this briefly with 2 clips. I'm going to come back to the former clip and sort of play a few other parts of where that clip originates from, purely because it's around the context of immigration, or the desire to have immigration control in Scotland, or better yet, just immigrants coming to Scotland. But I thought I would sort of compare and contrast that to the second clip that I played in quick succession, which was from Sky News, which was obviously speaking about net migration figures being record level high, sky high, you know, all in the context, of course, of a hostile environment, according to the Scottish National Party. It's a sort of trope that's beyond redundant at this point. To sort of insinuate that there's a hostile environment, even if there ever was a quote-unquote hostile environment at any point in time. There sure as hell is not one now, but the SNP continuously seem to live out this sort of fantasy, or the very bare minimum sort of perpetuate the notion that this fantasy, this alternative reality exists. A reality in which this so-called hostile environment still actually exists and permeates every facet of society. Here's another wee example of this. So if I come on to one of the tabs I've got open here, as I'm sort of known as DJ10 tabs, I've got about 20 open this time around, but I won't be using them all this time. But this is from the SNP's website. It says Labour's anti-immigration stance is harming Scotland. Okay, this is from the 9th of October. I'm not going to go through this sort of poo throwing at Labour, because they're all just effectively the same Trojan horse, just with a different color. But if we come down just to this part here where it says, speaking on the BBC Sunday show, Anas Sarwar confirmed his party would not push for the Scottish Parliament to hold powers over immigration. And then it says here, though, this is what's fundamentally important about this. And this is a sort of point that seems to get lost in all of the sort of rhetoric and discussion and hyperbole and nonsense and tropes and cliches, etc., thrown back and forth. It says here, it is obvious that Scotland faces an urgent demographic challenge, distinct from the rest of the UK, with an ageing population that is projected to fall to 1.5% or by 1.5% by 2045, while at the same time the UK population as a whole is expected to grow by almost 6%. Right? But this aspect here with an aging population, right? And it's an urgent demographic challenge. Okay, and their solution has always been and will always be immigration. These immigration powers, whether that be via their quote-unquote independence utopia or whether that be via having devolved immigration powers at their disposal, immigration by hook or by crook is their only remedy to what they classify as demographic challenges, upcoming demographic challenges. You know, we need the powers over immigration in order to ensure that our aging population doesn't continue to age. We need immigration powers to ensure that our demographic challenge no longer becomes a challenge. But when you start to sort of read past the sort of verbiage that you see on screen or when you hear them speaking at podiums and whatnot and really think about what that entails, that's where the worrying aspect of all of this is. The notion that there's a hostile environment for immigration is preposterous in nature, purely on the basis that we're seeing record levels of immigration entering the UK. The issue that is, as far as the SNP are concerned, that the vast majority of these people entering the United Kingdom are not coming to Scotland. They're moving to England, right? And England has a much larger problem when it comes to immigration, as well as demographic issues. But it's not just limited to England. We're starting to see this sort of trickle effect occurring in Glasgow and now Edinburgh, but more in particular Glasgow. But the point is, though, that the vast majority of immigrants enter the UK and go to England. They don't come to Scotland, but that somehow justifies the SNP to be able to speak about a so-called hostile environment. If there was a hostile environment, then we wouldn't be seeing the record level numbers of people entering the UK for work or for whatever the fuck it may be. They deliberately ignore this. They deliberately try to portray themselves as ignorant to this fact that the UK is seeing seriously worrying numbers of immigrants entering the country year on year. They deliberately ignore that fact and they get away with doing so because of the mean words and the mean statements that are said about people entering the UK illegally via boats. Right. And they also get away with saying these things about the hostile environment because we're not seeing the ramifications of mass migration because the vast majority of them are entering are entering England as opposed to here. But on top of that, I think it really does strike at the heart of the issue when they continuously bring up demography. Demographic challenges and projections, computer projections. All of Scotland's population growth is projected via computers to come from immigration over the next 5 to 10 years. The vast majority of Scotland's population growth over the past 20 years has come from immigration. At no point, though, is demography ever brought up. At no point is the long-term consequences of these actions ever brought up. If the SNP had the ability to control and dictate who entered Scotland as opposed to the UK at large, if the SNP had the ability to entice as many foreigners as possible into Scotland in order to rectify the demographic challenges, etc., There's never any discussion, never at any point is it addressed what that could potentially mean long-term, demographically speaking. So for all their BS about apparently being concerned about demographic challenges, they're just full of shit, in all honesty, because they never at any point bring up the actual demography of Scotland, and that is a concern. Over the same period, it is projected there will be a 22% fall in the number of children in Scotland and a 30% rise in the number of over 65s. And at no point do they ever bring up anything that could be done to potentially reverse the trends at play here. Record low birth rates, lowest on record since 1855, since records began. Scottish people just are not having children. Why is there no sort of long-term study / consultation or policy even being proposed, let alone implemented, to try and rectify these issues? They don't, they never will, and they never have proposed anything to rectify / reverse these trends. They just accept that these trends are occurring. They try to insinuate that this is just the status quo, and their go-to solution / remedy is always and will always be immigration. And in order to try and get the public to come on board with these solutions and these proposals and this rhetoric, they have to try their damnedest to throw in as much hyperbole as possible, such as insinuating that there's a hostile environment at present. There is not a hostile environment whatsoever. Nor are the Tories shifting to the right, nor are the Tories remotely right-wing, nor are the Tories far-right in nature, nor is there a hostile environment. Hundreds of thousands of people are entering the UK year upon year, right? So it's just disingenuous in nature, deceptive in nature, manipulative in nature, and above all, it's just opportunistic, really. There's nothing much else that can be said in that front. However,
there's a bit of context that's worth just remembering here. Of course, 2016, you had Brexit, EU referendum, then you had COVID, so you can probably note that period there. So, migration dropping down a lot there, a lot of people leaving as well. But then it's those new Brexit rules and new immigration rules coming in that really kickstarts that big leap in migration, in net migration. And when you look at where people are coming from or indeed going to, well, this is EU citizens. And you can see before Brexit, it was relatively strong, hundreds of thousands, and then into negative territory after Brexit. That's EU citizens leaving the UK. Then you've got UK citizens, and then consider this, non-EU citizens coming into the UK in their droves.
Coming in their droves. Sky News, far-right Sky News. Coming in their droves. And still there's a hostile environment, apparently. They're lying by omission, in all honesty. But sort of to conclude my point there before I continue on, like, for all their rhetoric and their hyperbole, etc., nobody is ever looking at the long-term ramifications. If Scottish people are not having children, or they're not having enough children, and the solution to this problem is to import people to have children on behalf of the Scottish people who are not having children, long-term, mathematically speaking, long-term, it will inevitably come to a point in time, maybe not necessarily in my generation, nor my child's generation, or his child's generation, but at some point down the line, it will come to a point, the tipping point, where the scales will tip, and we will get to a point where, first and foremost, replacement level, below replacement level births, etc., that will never, ever, ever be able to be reversed to a point where things could go back to the status quo. But it will get worse than that. And eventually what will become the reality for the remainder of Scottish people in the future is that their people, the Scots, will cease to exist. And it's not inflammatory language to point that out, nor is it catastrophizing. Nothing of the sort. It's just a pretty simplistic mathematical equation. is Scottish people are not having children or enough children to be able to sustain themselves as a population and as an ethnic group. And then you're bringing people into Scotland alongside these people to have children on behalf of the Scottish people that they're living alongside upon moving in. It will inevitably come to a point where the people brought in to have children on behalf of the childless Scots, they will begin to outnumber the Scots. And that outnumbering will continue to increase in nature percentage-wise to such a point that the Scots dwindle out in numbers and then eventually cease to exist. It's maths. It's simple. It's not a fucking conspiracy, nor is it far right. But you never hear that from our government. You never hear that from our activists. You never hear that in our media. Never at any point is it ever addressed what this could mean long term. Instead, anybody with the temerity / audacity to try and point out what I've just said there is met with the inevitable smears of being conspiratorial in nature and or being racist and or being a bigot, etc., etc. You know? So on that note,
a few years ago, out of curiosity and with a passion for genealogy, I sent off my DNA to find out my genetic makeup. And my father and I are keen genealogists, and I really enjoy the shared passion that we have. So you can imagine the joy when my father also did his DNA, and we were in fact confirmed matches. As I prepared for my speech today, I went and logged in to check the updates for my DNA profile, as they often change as the technology updates and improved. I'm 88% Scottish, 7% Irish, 4% Norwegian, and 1% Danish/Swedish. So as I contemplated the complex mixes of human DNA, I'm reminded of the vital role migrants play in Scotland's history and future. And as I look through the many records of my dad and trace the steps of those gone before, it creates a connection between us and them, and it paints a picture of diverse and mobile people.
So this is me going back to where I initially pulled the first clip up from. The context of this is obviously a debate, so-called debate. The Scottish Parliament are infamous for this at this point, where they sort of conduct 2 to 3 hour sessions going over some specific policy or paper or bill, whatever the case may be, and they have the temerity to sort of classify it as a debate. And you quite often, more often than not, come to find that it's like cross-party consensus about it all. The only sort of differing points that you may on occasion hear is, like in the case of, for example, climate change related debates, say, quote unquote, you know, some of the people in the parliament might come out and argue against the speeds of the, you know, the actions that are proposed or are being undertaken. Some say it's going too fast, some say it's not going fast enough, you know, or in this case about immigration. We have Karen Adams from the SNP here, so she's going to speak, well, she's already done so, speak some tripe about her genealogy, alludes to the fact that she's 88% Scottish, and that somehow then in turn, because of the little parts that are sprinkled on top of that, has allowed her to start thinking deep and profoundly about what connects her to the other, and about diversity, etc. You know, sort of alluding to, without having to say it out loud, you know, we're a nation of immigrants. You're 88% Scottish, right? But anyway, before I get to that, you know, this quote unquote debate sort of centers around some people talking about, yes, we need immigration. We all agree that Scotland's population is aging. We all agree we need immigrants, but you know, you need to stop banging this drum about devolved immigration powers. You need to stop banging the independence drum and work together with Westminster. Whereas the other side, which is the vast majority of people within said parliament, within said debate, quote unquote, are waffling nonsense such as herself. But, you know, this nation of immigrants nonsense is really, really frustrating. And it kind of ties back into something I said before I played that little segment there about the long-term ramifications, because there seems to have been a very, very concise and deliberate attempt, and has been for many a year, if you've observed Scottish politics, to sort of eradicate the mere notion of a native Scot / Indigenous Scot. You know, you'll always be met with pushback by people who will turn around and say something to the effect of, well, define Indigenous. Nobody's really Indigenous. But yeah, it's remarkable, really, how then people can then in turn take DNA tests, genealogy tests, and it transpires they're 80+% Scottish, or even 90% plus Scottish, you know? Like, these things matter. Clearly they matter. Ethnicity matters, but it's sort of fallen by the wayside in favor of this notion that anybody can come here and be Scottish. You know, I'm just as Scottish as an Sarwar. I'm just as Scottish as Hamza Yusuf. Hamza Yusuf is just as Scottish as my great grandfather, despite the fact that's vehemently incorrect in nature. But to suggest that fact out loud can quite often lead you into a position where you're forced to justify yourself, or you're branded a racist. You know, these are not really difficult topics to accept, or points to accept. They're just taboo in nature because of the status quo. And I just find it remarkable that this clip here, I'm 88% Scottish, and it made me think about the diversity. You're Scottish. You're conceding you're fucking Scottish. Overwhelmingly Scottish. You might very well have some input from other ethnic enclaves somewhere down your family tree, but for the most part, you're predominantly Scottish. You know? So again, you acknowledge that fact, but yet you're in support. You are in favor of proposals to import people who are not Scottish, not thinking about the long-term consequences of what that means for you as a Scot, or your descendants, who I assume are Scottish. You know, it really is remarkable.
These connections support an understanding of human existence, and it's not different for us, as we are here today in Scotland, to sometimes desire to live where we can get work, where we are safe, and where we are ultimately going to survive, like many people across the globe. It's human nature to want to create a better life for us and our families. Migrants' contributions are invaluable, from bolstering our economy to enriching our culture, particularly in rural and island areas. And our nation has been and continues to be shaped by migration. The influx of people from the European Union had transformed Scotland, helping to reverse the trend of population decline, and brought a surge of cultural diversity and global perspective.
Cultural diversity, shaping our nation. Just tripe, really. Again, for all the European immigration that entered Scotland over the past 20 odd years or so, it didn't really make much of a dent in terms of the overall demography of the country, right? I mean, according to the 2011 census, about 87, 86%, might even have been more, because for my sins, I can't remember the actual statistic. But let's just say, for argumentation's sake, that it was about 87% of the overall population that filled in the census. And obviously, you can't take a census at face value, because some people will fill it in incorrectly. Some people don't even bother filling them in at all and whatnot. But for the most part, the vast majority of people that participate in a census are doing so correctly. So far, I'm just adding that wee caveat there. So let's just say that 87% of Scotland, according to the 2011 census, was Scottish, right? And then, of course, it was 96% white overall in that census. 87% of said white was Scottish. The rest was made up of people from the UK, other parts of the UK, and on top of that, European immigration. It didn't really make a dent, right? But if this continues, and this is what they want to continue, and to be honest, it is continuing anyway, we're just not seeing the same levels as of yet in Scotland as parts of England are seeing. But if this continues, it will no longer be 96% white. No longer will it be 87% Scottish. It will become 80% Scottish, 90% white, 70% Scottish, 75 or 80% white, you know? And it's remarkable how every census that comes out, the white/Scottish aspect of things declines. The BAME population, as it's referred to as, increases, albeit just slightly for now in Scotland, but it's still increasing. The Scottish and even the white majority are declining, and what's increasing is the non-white population. Never mentioned, though. Never mentioned, because it's fine for now. This is like Ivory Towers epitomized, really. The policies that they're advocating for, the rhetoric that they spit out in order to sort of bolster and justify and validate their policies and their proposals. It's all very well and good to speak of this now. But even the waffle about, our cultural diversity, what does that fucking mean? What does that really mean? They never actually have to explain themselves because they're never met with pushback nor request to answer. They just say what they want. They just roll out the buzzwords. And even if these things were net positives for the country, cultural diversity, our nation's being shaped by immigration, cultural diversity, even if that was a net plus, still no mention, nor will you hear any mention of the demographic consequences long term. And that's the problem I've had for a long time. Anyway.
The progress we have made, however, is under threat from UK governments past and present, from dragging us out of the EU against our will and to the Home Office's hostile environment approach to immigration. Being shackled to the United Kingdom will do nothing but hinder us as we try to address Scotland's unique demographic challenges. We're bound by these UK policies, and as long as we are, our efforts to address these issues are severely constrained. Those currently going through the UK government's cruel asylum system are unable to work under UK employment law, and some of those are receiving just £9.58 per week. That is pitiful, and it's left some of the most desperate people in desperate conditions. Without independence, we are only able to mitigate the cruelty dealt by Westminster, and I believe that that is not a good enough position to be in. I am proud that our Equalities Committee has called on the Scottish Government to provide free bus travel for people in the asylum system. There are things we can do, and we are doing, but we need to do more. The oversight of the immense value immigrants bring to rural communities, such as those in the North East, especially in my constituency of Banffshire and Buchan Coast, has persisted for too long. Westminster's control over migration policy, epitomised by the hostile environment, has inflicted considerable harm on both migrants and on Scotland.
Hostile environment, again, brought up. I mean, it's all too common, honestly. But then she brought up as well that there's asylum seekers, then they earn the bare minimum of taxpayer-funded benefits, and they can't work, And it's almost as if, time after time, they will continuously... I mean, you could, I suppose, pat them on the back for their empathy. They continuously play off one another's emotions and sympathies towards the foreigner. And they tug at the people's heartstrings to try and insinuate that these individuals have very hard lives when they come here, seeking a better life, etc. But the reality of the matter is they're catered for. The vast majority of them are up and down the UK in taxpayer-funded hotels where they get free meals as well as a free bed, as well as free showers and whatnot. It's not like they're living in squalor. It's not like they are living in tents up and down the country, like the Calais jungle back in the day. No, quite the opposite, in fact. They're really clutching at straws with their insinuations and their allegations. But it sort of eludes or gives you a sort of look into the future as to what an independent, quote unquote, Scotland would look like. Because they're incessant, never ending, regurgitated allegations of a hostile environment directed towards asylum seekers, etc., etc., etc. So if they got their way, whether that be via devolved powers or independence, quote unquote, they would do the opposite to what they claim is apparently taking place. So we would have a humane immigration system. We would have a humane and socially just asylum system, aka open borders, aka asylum seekers could work, as well as visas being accepted in quick succession, asylum applications rarely, if ever, being rejected. And even the waffle of, they're seeking a better life, they're all refugees fleeing poverty in war-torn countries, and the vast majority of the people that are actually seeking asylum are military-aged men. The vast majority of them are men, but they never acknowledge this fact. They never acknowledge the fact that a good chunk of them aren't even from countries that are war-torn in nature. That's why they've sort of expanded their descriptions of them by saying that they're seeking a better life, because that's sort of, if you scratch beneath the surface of that statement, you start to establish that they're insinuating that they're fleeing poverty or climate change, So it's not even a case of now fleeing war and persecution. It's just simply seeking a better life, which really makes them no different to an economic migrant. But we can't say that, because that's hostile environment rhetoric, And they make such a contribution. They all make such a contribution, despite the fact they don't. Some might very well come here and work in the NHS. Some might very well come here and be doctors and engineers and scientists, etc., etc., etc. As far as the NHS is concerned, though, it's more or less a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, because the more people that we import, the more people we're going to need to be in medical positions to accommodate them, But the infrastructure is not in place for the mass importation of people, hence why there's a housing crisis, hence why there's infrastructure crises at large, schools and GPs, etc. But these are issues that can't be discussed nor even addressed or acknowledged, because in doing so, you're met with the proverbial hyperbolic language that you are playing into the narrative of a hostile environment. Oh, you're being racist, you're a bigot. They're a net benefit, they contribute so much. Like Abdul coming to Scotland to work in a shop, Tesco's or a Morrison's or I don't know, McDonald's. It's hardly making a contribution to our society. And even if every single person that entered the UK illegally or otherwise genuinely made a fucking contribution to our society and economy, that still does not address the long-term ramifications of continuing what we're seeing. It doesn't address the demographic consequences, the mathematical inevitabilities that are on the horizon. It never does, but it's fine because they make a contribution to society. At what point do we put empathy to the side and start focusing on our own people? It's something that you will never hear addressed by our politicians, never hear addressed by our media. No one will ever address these issues. And you have to wonder why that is the case. In all sincerity,
declaring a personal interest in this. As a first-generation migrant to this country, coming to the UK from Pakistan as a wee girl, I look at how the UK immigration system treats people now with a deep sense of sadness. Of course, this is largely due to the treatment of those who come here either searching for a better life, new opportunities, or just to join their families, in my case. Like many of us here, I feel a sense of sadness for the loss of opportunities in an immigration system that has been taglined as a hostile environment, for heaven's sake. And I have to say, I am relieved that Suella Braverman is no longer serving as UK Home Secretary. While I'm already disappointed in some of the rhetoric coming from her successor, never have I known a more intentionally and dangerously divisive person to hold such a high office. And that the Prime Minister allowed her to hold on to the office for so long means that the damage that has been done is now on him. Presiding officer, immigrants are woven into the rich tartan that makes our country what it is. Our early history was a melting pot of Britons, Picts, Angles, the Gaels, the Norse, and even more recent history has seen the face of Scotland enriched by substantial migration from Ireland in the 1800s, Pakistan and South Asia from around the 1960s, and even more recently from the
They always bring up, or they have been doing so, Suella Braverman. You know, quite often this was brought up during the duration of this hour to 2 hour. I'm not entirely sure how long it is actually. Let me see. About 2 hours, almost. They just keep bringing up Suella Braverman, and it wasn't limited to this earlier sort of First Minister's questions and or general questions or topical questions, all sort of segments you can find on Scottish Parliament's YouTube channel. Not YouTube channel. Well, yeah, you can as well, but their Parliament TV on the internet. It just keeps being brought up. You know, all the egregious comments she made, the outlandish, hateful comments that she made. I'm not entirely sure what was said from herself. What part of it was incorrect in nature? She said multiculturalism has failed. You know, now if a white woman had said that, or a white man had said that, holding the position that she held at the time, they would have been chastised in nature for being racist. They can't obviously insinuate that she's racist because she's brown. Suella Braverman, obviously, who I'm speaking about, but they've still gone out of their way to spurg out over her comments. And they've all celebrated in such times as her being sort of demoted. But I'm not entirely sure what part of her statement was incorrect. Again, this kind of boils down to the sort of ivory tower narrative. You know, the sort of meme, the concept, the cliche of an ivory tower. Scotland as a whole, it could be argued, for the most part, is an ivory tower in nature, where our politicians can grandstand and climb aboard moral high horses and skip about the place and speak about how evil and racist things are, when English people or people living in England, what they say, how evil and racist these things are, when they don't experience the things that these people living in England or the English people themselves actually experience. Multiculturalism has failed. Well, just go to certain parts of England and see for yourself how that's working out. Birmingham, London. You know, do I need to go on? I could, but why should I? Should be apparent. You know, and I'm pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, that Suella Braverman's comments were actually in the context of the sort of Israel-Palestine BS, as opposed to actually just having an issue with mass migration as a whole. But still, that's wrong. She can't be saying that. But then, of course, Q-Cab Stewart, a Pakistani who now calls herself Scottish, which she's fucking not. It's not racist for me to say that. I mean, I'm sick of this. This kind of, again, there is an overhanging theme to the point of me recording this and rambling for as long as I have. And it's the demography argument, the long-term ramifications, the mere existence / acceptance of us as a people. It's been forgotten about deliberately. Completely and utterly forgotten about. We are expendable in nature. But Q-Cab Stewart, a Pakistani who just slaps on the Scottish label to herself as if it's fucking acceptable, And she says, you know, she starts off, oh, our melting pot, our history. You're not from Scotland, so what are you on about our history? I mean, I could never at any point in my life, irrespective of how much money I had or how much confidence I had or how big my balls were, I don't think I could ever stand in a foreign land and stand in their parliament and speak about their history, but sort of latch onto it and not even call it their history, call it my own as well, or pretend I'm part of it. So, like standing in Japan's parliament and talking about our Japanese history, or standing in fucking Bulgaria and talking about our Bulgarian history, or standing in Vietnam and talking about our Vietnamese history, or standing in Argentina and talking about our Argentine history. It's just remarkable to me how that is a foreign concept as far as my mindset works, but yet these people just do it as if it's second nature. But she says our history, our melting pot, initially was Britons and Picts and Anglos and Gaels and Norse, etc. Yeah, obviously very, very far back in the day, Scotland, before it was even called Scotland, when it was Pictland, was the vast majority of it was Picts that sort of dominated the area of Scotland, or modern day Scotland. And obviously there was the sort of invasions of the Norse, and there was the Gaels, and the Britons made up some aspects of the British Isles, but they weren't exactly the dominant force. The Anglos came from further afield. They weren't always here. By and large, in a Scottish context, it was the Picts. And the Picts merged with the Scotia to form Albaland in order to sort of push back against Viking invasions, you know. But even all of the aforementioned invasions, whether that be Norse or Viking, or Roman even, dare I say, they didn't really make much of an impact or a dent in the overall genealogy of the fucking island of Britain. No, they didn't. The Anglos obviously played their part down south to a certain extent, but in the Scottish context, there wasn't much of an impact made by Romans, nor Anglos even, dare I say, or even the Norse. Yeah, there's a lot more sort of heritage to be found by people in the islands as opposed to the mainland for, you know, for people with like Norse heritage, but by and large, there wasn't much of a dent that was made. The sort of genealogy remained the same for many a century. It's only in recent times, to which she further on alludes to, oh, and then, you know, in the 1960s, or even like when she brings up the Irish, as if they've made such a fucking impact on the population and demography, you know? By and large, Irish and Scottish people aren't really that dissimilar. However, they didn't make much of an impact overall, because whether or not it's on racial lines or even on ethnic lines, people stick to their own for the most part. And in the context of Irish moving to Scotland, for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, they had their own little ghettos and enclaves, impoverished, obviously, because of the fact that they were Catholic, living in a Protestant nation. They didn't make much of an impact in the overall demography, right? But then she alludes to the Pakistanis and other Asians that moved in. You didn't make a dent on our history / demography either. You were insignificant in nature, percentage-wise. It's only really in the last maybe 10 years in Scotland, 20 years UK-wide, that we're starting to see noticeable changes in specific parts of the country or the UK at large. But the justification is always presented nowadays from these individuals to try and brush away concern. Or we've always been a nation of immigrants. We've not. And if you really want to get down to the sort of petty semantics of things, all of the aforementioned groups that she brought up, bar the Asians towards the end, they were all white. Well, they all looked the same on face value, phenotypically speaking. You know, I'm not saying that's right either, because I have just as much of an issue with Scotland being flooded with Eastern Europeans as I would with people from fucking Pakistan. Doesn't matter to me because I'm not a white supremacist. You know, Scotland for the Scottish, a sort of concept that has become null and void, can't be spoken about, taboo. And in its place, we have to accept this waffle.
Government brought forward a motion to debate the issue of Scotland having an immigration policy that suited the needs of Scotland. The motion was challenged by both the Labour and Tory party, and they're doing it again today. Now, firstly, there is no doubt in some of the merits of the topic that Martin Whitfield proposed. Homelessness is a scourge in our society, which the thankfully now sacked ex-Home Secretary Suella Braverman thought she could eradicate by destroying the tents that homeless people had clearly made a lifestyle choice to live in. Naked, callous Tory values on display yet again, and I am sure that at least some of our colleagues over there are utterly ashamed to be associated with such a political choice. I will, yeah.
Paul Sweeney.
Does it not recognise the supreme irony of the Home Secretary's comments about homelessness being a lifestyle choice when it's Home Office policy that risks imminently putting over 1,400 people on the streets of Glasgow because of the expedited approach to resolving asylum claims in the city?
I could not agree more. However, the motivation behind Martin Whitfield's amendment was as disappointing as it was glaring in its real agenda. Now, we've always known that the Tories will put the union first. It is in their very name. So there's no surprise that they would throw a tantrum at the mere mention of a debate in this Parliament to discuss an immigration policy for the benefit of Scotland. Because for them, only the big Parliament in Westminster that Stephen Kerr is now desperately trying to get himself elected to, while he tells our First Minister he should know his place, it's there that they should get to decide how Scotland's immigration policy should work because, well, presiding officer, that's an argument they will have to justify to the people. It's certainly not for me. And I said at the start of my contribution that the Labour attack on the government's decision to debate how to improve Scotland's future was more surprising. But in reality, is it? They're the architects of Schedule 5, Part 1B of the 1998 Scotland Act. That prevents the people of Scotland deciding our own constitutional future without the express permission of Westminster. Now, there's an irony here, though, because it was in fact Henry McLeish who said during a select committee on Scottish affairs session in 1998, as the Scotland Act was being scrutinised, and I quote, "I think it comes to the point that in 5, 10 or 50 years' time, that the United Kingdom will be a very different place constitutionally and in governmental terms. What I do believe is right is to leave it to the separate parts of the UK to work out their own particular destiny." And yet they impose Schedule 5, Part 1B into the Scotland Act. Now, this Labour don't even want us debating the issue in this chamber. An issue that will add value to our economy, make us productive, bring tax revenue in for vital public services, and generally help to build the feel-good factor that a country needs, especially when things have been absolutely trashed by the other unionists.
Before I sort of address briefly what he was saying towards the end of his wee speech there, I just thought I would showcase to people, if they weren't aware of, the sort of question, the interjection from Paul Sweeney there about the Home Office allegedly making people homeless in Glasgow, what that's really about. I'm going to play this clip because I clipped it on my channel not too long ago, so people can see for themselves what I'm actually what this is about, in all honesty, because quite frankly, it's remarkable how they can just say these things so matter-of-factly, and again, there's never really any context, nor even if there is context provided, there's never like any sort of explanation to sort of, inform the listener or whomever it may be about the context and how this has come to be in the first place. No, we can't think about these things.
1,800 asylum claims are expected to be approved in Glasgow as the Home Office attempts to clear a record backlog of cases. But it's feared that will lead to more than 1,000 refugees needing social housing. And if there's nowhere to place them, they may end up homeless. Selina Jackson has been taking a look at a system stretched to breaking point.
There are more than 5,000 asylum seekers in Scotland. Around 90% are living in temporary accommodation in Glasgow. Most have fled war, persecution, and threats to their lives. And now, in a country where they've sought safety, those who are given the right to stay end up facing yet another challenge.
My brothers just got a call from him, hey, we got eviction letter, but we just got 8 days to move. And I was like, wow, 8 days is not enough just to find a new flat.
Applying for refugee status can be a long and complicated process. When their claims are approved, people find themselves in a race against the clock. When the Home Office approves a refugee application, the person should receive a letter telling them this. They should also be sent a biometric residence permit, which gives them the right to study, live and claim benefits in the UK. After receiving their acceptance letter, the refugee will also get a discontinuation letter, which tells them their financial support will end in 28 days. Following that, they should be sent an eviction letter from their accommodation provider, and legally, they can be told to move out within 7 days. But delays throughout the process mean many people don't have the full month to get their lives in order.
So effectively, the Home Office, according to what was being said last month anyway, the Home Office are planning to sort of increase or accelerate the amount of asylum applications that they grant in order to sort of shorten the queue, the never-ending queue, right? So as a result, it's going to lead to some people being unable to find a house or be given a house. It's going to make some people homeless because immediately after they are granted acceptance on an asylum basis, their temporary accommodation is effectively no longer theirs. It will be given to another individual who's waiting for their application to be accepted or rejected. So because of the increase and the acceleration to applications being accepted and whatnot, it's going to lead to an influx of people being unable to reside in a temporary accommodation. And obviously, as a result of that, the sort of accusation that's then presented is the Home Office are making people homeless. Never is there any accountability nor responsibility at the foot of the people who have done nothing bar for the past arguably 5 to 6 years, maybe even more. Never is there any responsibility or accountability at their feet for their incessant attempts to demand and encourage and entice as many people to come here as humanly possible. You know, so much so as as far as the Ukrainians were concerned, Nicola Sturgeon at the time had gone out of her way to insist that Scotland would, the sponsor scheme that was put into place, Scotland would sponsor them, as opposed to in England, where the sort of refugee sponsorship scheme would be applicable if somebody, obviously vetted and whatnot, had the ability to take somebody into their house. If they had a spare room or whatnot, they would then in turn have said person in their house. That was what was classified as a sponsorship. Whereas in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon went above and beyond and insisted that we'll take as many Ukrainians in as possible and we will just keep them in temporary accommodation until such a time as we can find them a house, even if we can't find them a fucking house, you know? So if you're all in favor of advocating for as many people to come here as possible, don't be too shocked when... let me actually retract that. When you advocate for as many people to come here as possible, while simultaneously applying pressure wherever possible on the people that have the power and control over whether or not people are able to stay here or not, when you apply vigorous amounts of pressure to ensure that people's claims are dealt with more quickly, whilst you ignore simultaneously the housing shortages that we face as a country overall, don't be too fucking shocked when there's nowhere for them to go. Maybe the elephant in the room would be to stop importing people here until such a time as we have the services and infrastructure in place to be able to accommodate them. But even then, before we start opening our arms to be so progressive and diverse and wet wipery in nature, we should be fixated on helping our own, But we will not do that, nor will we even acknowledge that that should be done, nor should we acknowledge that that is a necessity. No, instead, we will just continuously do all we can to encourage and entice as many people to come here as humanly possible, and we will just fucking brush off any responsibility and accountability and blame it all on Westminster. At the end of the day, like, you are just as complicit as every member of the Home Office and Westminster who have sat on their hands and allowed these problems to intensify in nature. This is what I find the most repulsive about the SNP, to be honest, because they're always going on about what more we can do and how many more we could let in, etc., when they just ignore the fundamental flaws. And of course, furthermore, they ignore the demographic consequences. So there's that. And the other thing as well that he mentioned, you know, and many of them will allude to this and do allude to this, and it's not limited to this so-called debate. They bring up unionism and words of that effect. They'll blame Brexit and the lack of freedom of movement and as for why we need devolved immigration powers, ignoring the fact, though, for all of the years that the UK as a bloc was part of the EU and had freedom of movement at its disposal, throughout all of that time, still even then, for the decades upon decades that was a thing, the vast majority of immigrants moved to England as opposed to Scotland. It's just a cop-out to blame Brexit or lack thereof on the sort of demographic problems that we're on the verge of facing as a nation. Very easy to blame that, you know. And if they got devolved immigration powers tomorrow, what would they do differently to what the UK wasn't doing anyway? I think the reality of the matter here is that in time, if they get their wish, by hook or by crook, whether that be their so-called independence route, or whether that be just getting devolved immigration powers at their disposal, what you're going to start to see is less of an influx of EU migration. And it's funny as well how they always bring up freedom of movement, EU freedom of movement. This is how they sort of butter up the idea, the sugarcoat the idea. But really, as I said, compare and contrast to when we were part of the European Union to now, what's different? You know, if they had devolved immigration powers, what would be different to what was different back then? The only difference would be really is that they would have the ability to entice and attract anybody from anywhere. And if they couldn't attract EU migration at enough or sustainable, dare I say, levels to sort of substantiate the population in years gone by, they're sure as fuck not going to be able to do so now. Which then leads you to the consensus, the inevitable consensus that what they're really angling for here is third world immigration, you know? And of course, that is just exactly what Scotland needs in order to rectify its demographic challenges, which then in turn leads you back to the demography issue. When you start to import people from Africa and the Middle East, to come here to work and to find a better life and to have children on your behalf because you're not having children, inevitably the scales tip and the Scots become a dwindling minority, and inevitably in time, due to mathematics and not conspiracies, they cease to exist.